Martha Alibali. I work at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, Wisconsin, in the United States. My position there is a professor of psychology, and I also have an affiliate appointment in the Department of Educational Psychology. I do research on a number of topics related to thinking, learning, and teaching. I study children's mathematical reasoning and their scientific reasoning, and I study instructional practices in math and science. I also do research looking at how teachers communicate about important concepts for in both in the classroom and sort of more informally when they work one-on-one with students. We all produce gestures when we speak, and we produce different sorts of gestures. Sometimes we produce gestures that are kind of rhythmic, that kind of go along with the pace of speech, but sometimes we produce gestures that actually represent the ideas that we're talking about. So for example, if I wanted to talk about a circle, I might trace a circle in the air. I might say something was round. Those gestures actually reflect things that we are thinking in the moment. They reflect the mental images and motor imagery that we may be activating. We can look at people's gestures to get at some of the things that they are thinking. And sometimes we see that the gestures that people produce reveal things about the things they're thinking about. Sometimes the gestures say a little more. So I might say, I made her a cake. And I can show that the cake was round. It wasn't square or rectangular, it was round. So gestures both tell us something about the content of what people are thinking, and they also might indicate something about the sort of readiness for change that children are experiencing. And so we've found that children's gestures are actually a really revealing and interesting window onto what they know and do. In teacher-student interactions and in parent-child interactions that people are actually quite receptive to this. They're often in those moments trying to kind of help kids express their ideas, and they often seem to draw on the ways that children are gesturing. Like, we take in information from other people's gestures all the time as we're communicating. We don't need extra training to do it. However, being aware of it and being aware that it is a channel that can provide valuable information, I think is important for teachers to know. For classrooms where there are many students, where the students, have diverse language backgrounds, diverse language abilities, a broader recognition that gesture is a mode of expressing like real knowledge, that it really reflects things kids know, even if they're not able to say them, that can give some different perspectives on them. I do think that students are getting a lot of information out of teachers' gestures, and that teachers actually do have the ability to modify their gestures. They can reflect about their gestures and use them intentionally and purposely. So two things that I think are really important in that regard. One is that teachers regularly use gestures to guide children's attention to things that are important in the lesson at that moment. Some teachers do this more than others, and I actually think it's something that's really valuable for kids. Teachers point to what they're talking about, for example, if it's written on the board. And then the other key thing is that gesture is really good at connecting ideas. So for example, a teacher might be talking about, the connections between an equation and a graph, for example, and, might want to help children understand how parts of the equation are represented in the graph, where the y-intercept is in the equation and the y-intercept in the graph, or the slope of the line in the equation and the slope of the line in the graph. And so teachers, I'm actually very interested in how teachers use gestures to help students make those connections. In some of our studies, we've actually asked kids to either perform actions or produce gestures in particular ways, as that can actually help solidify those concepts for children. So we ask kids to represent equations. For example, like 5 + 2 is equal to 4 + what? And so we had them put 5 bean bags in one bucket and then 2 bean bags, and then in the other bucket put 4 bean bags. At each point they would feel the buckets to see whether they felt the same. So they're holding the buckets and actually experiencing with their bodies that weight. And then could add bean bags to the other bucket until they felt the same, and then think about like what that means in terms of like balancing an equation. And then later, when we had kids solve and explain other equations, the kids who'd had experience with the buckets were very likely to use both hands in gesturing to the equations. Some of the kids actually talked about the weight on each side of the equation. It seemed clear that their physical experience with the buckets and beanbags was being activated later when they solved the symbolic problems. Even when the beanbags weren't around, they were actually calling to mind, thinking about their experience with the buckets and beanbags. And we saw this in they're using two-handed gestures and in a few cases in the language that they used. Madison is in the Midwest, which is kind of in the center of the United States. It's a kind of mid-sized city, but also the home of the flagship university campus for the University of Wisconsin system. So I work in a department of psychology. So I'm in a department with, social psychologists and developmental psychologists and cognitive psychologists and biological psychologists. So a big range of people studying different aspects of psychology. But I'm also affiliated with the Department of Educational Psychology and the Wisconsin Center for Education Research. It's a very active and large campus. There's tons of clubs and organizations and things to do and beautiful places to hang out along the lakefront. If I had sort of one message to say for teachers, well, maybe 2, but to value children's actions, the gestures that they produce as they try to explain their understanding, and the kinds of connections they're trying to make, and as a teacher to support children to make the kinds of connections that we think are important and that they value. Because I believe that the deep understanding in math and in science sort of comes from making those connections.